As I was preparing for this morning and going through the lessons and the psalm and trying to pick out where this was going and getting a bit of a theme I could work with, there was one that did pop into it. And in a couple of portions of the lessons and the lectionary, it came out just jumping right out at you. Otherwise, you had to work for it just a little bit more. But that central theme around which I want to work is caring. And that's why I mentioned the World Hunger Program as well. As we're getting into the first reading of Jeremiah, they spoke of the shepherds who did not always adequately care for their flocks. Most did, but there's always going to be a bit of a turn. Some shepherds were not as conscientious as others. And so the flocks were being scattered, and God's people were being scattered. The number of times that God's people were sent into exile, and then someone would bring them back. It was out and back, out and back. There was a great deal of shepherding that had to be done in order to keep God's people there alive and viable. I had an illustration of that shepherding a few years ago. I had an opportunity to attend a brief professional meeting in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area. And during that conference, we did a short tour to see what kinds of things extension educators had been doing in that region. And this particular tour went to visit a shepherd, a Native American shepherd, who kept a small flock of sheep up in the mountains. We drove up and up and up into the mountains to get up to where he was with his sheep. Finally, we came to a small, level, cleared area. Here was a little camper that he had parked. He did have a bottle there for some gas, but no running water, no electricity. And then he had a simple compound that he had made for the sheep. And I'd seen these before on television. I'd never seen one in person to really grasp it. You've probably seen them as well, and most often it would be in Africa, where you would see this big round pen made of the brush all kind of piled together, in a mound, and then a big circle around there. That's what made up the fence. And then at one spot there was an opening where they could chase the sheep into it. So that is what this elderly gentleman did every day. And the help that he had gotten was in how to manage around some of the pastures that he could use and how many sheep he could handle up there. But it kind of brought home that this shepherd really cared for his sheep in so many ways. He had provided different pasture areas that he could take them to each day so that they would have good grass to chew on. He had provided for them this pen, this compound, into which he could chase them each night, and then he'd pull a bunch of brush over and close off that gate. And it wasn't much, but it was enough to keep predators out of the pen and away from the sheep, so he protected the sheep in that way. And also the sacrifice that he made in order to protect his sheep, living up there in that mountaintop for months and months on end. An old ramshackle shed that he slept in and cooked his meals, and had very basic facility that he could live with. But he cared for his sheep. He had tremendous caring for them. So it really brought that home. So that was out of the first lesson. The shepherd having to gather his flock in, and the flock would get scattered. They were brought back because they cared tremendously. Of course, in the psalm, we talk about the good shepherd. It's an obvious one there. And people don't always think about where it's going. I didn't bring it this morning, but there was a nice piece a cousin shared with me about kind of what does it mean out of the 23rd Psalm, and verse by verse, giving just a little bit more of the assurances that Christ gives us, the abundance that he gives us, making sure we are fully taken care of. We are cared for by our Lord. Ephesians takes just a little bit different turn on things by reaching out to those who were not originally part of God's flock. He's reaching out to the Gentiles. He was thinking about the fact that they maybe had little hope in the world because they didn't know God. God had them as part of his plan. Obviously, he created them. But they didn't necessarily know God. And so how do you reach out to the Gentiles? To reach them, bring them in, and show that he cared. So he was giving that to them. He was giving his son for everyone, not just for the Jews, but for everyone, including the Gentiles. So he cared enough to make that ultimate sacrifice for all those people. Finally, we get though to the Gospel of Mark. where we see Jesus demonstrating his caring for the people. It opens up in that chapter, and obviously they'd been busy. The disciples and Jesus have been doing a lot of teaching and healing. And the disciples were sharing everything they'd been doing, and of course Jesus recognized they'd been busy, and he said, we need some rest. You need to take care of yourselves a little bit too. And I think that's anyone who's in a caring position needs to care for themselves as well. He recognized that, and he said, let's go to someplace deserted where we can rest a little bit. They hadn't even had time to eat. They'd been that busy. So they got into the boat. They headed out across the lake. It was probably the Sea of Galilee. It'd be a fair guess. Not a huge sea by any means, but giving them a chance perhaps to get away just a little bit and find another spot around the lake. Well, that didn't last long. As we're told in the gospel, people saw where they were going, they recognized, they ran ahead, and they were waiting for them when they got there in the store. Well, now what do? I guess we've got people who want no more, so we teach some more. Then I don't know if you caught exactly, there's a gap in the gospel there as far as the verses from that chapter. Two important stories are left out of our lessons this morning. I'll just mention them briefly. One was the feeding of the 5,000. He cared. By the end of the day, after they'd been teaching so many people, it was getting too late to go to some of the communities and find something to eat. So what did they do? They asked who had any food. 5 loaves, a couple of small fishes, and fed 5,000, had leftovers to beat the band. They cared. The other lesson, or the other story that is missing in that gap, relates to the disciples again getting out onto the lake, going again to that quiet spot. But the weather picked up, the storm picked up. Jesus calmed the storm, took care of them, and then they found another spot where they could come ashore, and again got caught teaching some more. But Jesus was caring. He was looking for ways in which he could care for people. And the people recognized that, and they came back. So it's always that common theme of going on and caring. There should be an obvious lesson to this, to us in this, that we're always being asked to care. Jesus is no longer with us today. We have to pick up the mantle. We have to show that part of it. He's bodily gone. Spiritually, yes, he's with us, in us all the time. But doing the job now comes to someone else. And we can be rather slow in times of showing that, really expressing that caring to people and bringing it out to those around us. I'd like to share just a couple of experiences with you, short stories that at the time, or maybe before even, they didn't mean, didn't give them a lot of thought, but at the time they just had a little meaning, and the farther you look back, the more meaning they had. Carol and I had have the opportunity to work at the State Fair each year. Many of you know that, and so a couple of years ago we had to go up to the State Fair and take care of some paperwork for employment purposes. And after we had done that, we stopped at a sandwich shop not far from the State Fairgrounds, picked up a couple of sandwiches and some chips and some beverage, found a park to eat some lunch. Well, as so often, these were rather big sandwiches and more than we could eat. So we each ate half of our sandwich, wrapped the other half up, thought we'd take it home for supper, and headed home. We were going down Lexington Avenue. Those of you that know that area of Lexington Avenue, University Avenue, and I-94, we're in kind of the midway part of the Twin Cities, may have relate or be able to relate to the fact that a lot of people are standing at the median along that section of street and highway looking for a handout. That section between University Avenue and I-94, it's got, 3 or 4 stoplights at least, so there's plenty of places for somebody to stop and or have to stop, and somebody else on the curb may ask for a handout. I don't recall for sure that day how many stoplights we may have had to stop at. Maybe we didn't have to stop at any, but we passed plenty of those people. We got up to the very last stoplight, just before turning onto the freeway. And there was a young woman sitting right there by the sign, the street sign, and she was just holding the usual sign, hungry, please help. And there was something about her that caught us. She was a young woman, clean, dressed reasonably well, not what you see very often in the street beggars. There was something, though, that caught us, and we just quickly said, should we give her a sandwich? Yeah, why not? So all they did was reach out the window with the bag that had our 2 half sandwiches, and she grabbed the bag, said thank you, she sat down, and she inhaled the sandwich so fast. I don't think she knew what was in that sandwich. Seriously, she opened up one of those sandwiches and bit into it and just chomped away. She was hungry, really hungry. We hadn't given it much thought beforehand, but realized here was someone who really was in need. And it gave you a good feeling right away that I guess that was the right thing to do. And the more you thought about it later, you thought, I should do that more often, perhaps. We kind of joked about it. We did have one downside on that. In the bag was also another bag of cheese curds we were hoping to enjoy later, but she could use it as well, so that was not a big issue, I guess. Another similar one, I think it was after that, perhaps. We took a few days and went to Arizona, spent a few days in the Tucson area. And when we travel, we frequently will pick up a bag of fruit and we'll chew on fruit while we're traveling, rather than a lot of other snacks. We were Sunday morning at church, getting ready to head back to the airport and coming home. Still had part of a bag of oranges left, it was. So we had to think about what are we going to do with these oranges. They may not be real friendly to us with oranges in the airport. As we were coming along, I missed the right-hand turn I needed to take to go toward the airport, so we were going down another block and hook back and come up. As we got back up to this same main intersection, here was a man again standing at the corner asking for help. And it was, this one I believe was a veteran who was obviously in some distress. And so we did again the quick look, out went the oranges, and again into the oranges as quickly as possible. So it was one of those things where, again, it was obviously the right thing to do. We didn't give it a lot of thought ahead of time. It was kind of a spur of the moment piece on our part, but it was appreciated by those people. It's the caring that goes with it. How often, though, have we passed people like that by? Whether they were looking for a few coins or a small bill or looking for something to eat, we pass them by. That's one that's obvious. And sometimes you get a little jaded because you do hear stories about people who make a living standing on a corner. Some make a pretty good living, we're told. I find that hard to imagine, but we pass those people by very often. Maybe we need to think again in other ways. But it's not just that sort of person that needs help. There are others who need that help and that caring as well, and they may be sitting right here and in the pews next to you or across the aisle, wherever it might be. Sometimes it's just that a person needs to have a smile, needs to have a greeting, needs to have a hand on their shoulder. Sometimes you just need to stop and listen. Sometimes you just need to let them know, hey, I'm here and I'm caring and I'm ready to help you. If you need someone to listen to, or to listen to you, I'm here. And sometimes that listening is just being there. Sometimes they don't quite know what to say either, and we may not know what to say in response. Sometimes it's just being there with them, caring, being a part of it. Those are the kinds of things that we can do and we can reach out to do. Some of us in the congregation are more able than others to help support the congregation financially. We all have different kinds of gifts. Among those gifts, though, that many of you have are that opportunity to be the carer, to share with others, to be the one that reaches out. So that's my challenge to you this morning. Think about the gifts that you have. Think about the caring you can give. And it can be anyone. It can be the kids. Nothing can warm many people up more than a little kid who looks at them and smiles and maybe reaches up to shake their hand. Didn't do anything more, but a little kid can do that for so many people. And those in the congregation who have trouble getting around, doesn't have to be going a lot. Sometimes it's just seeing someone, greet them, take a moment and give them a call sometime or something. Everyone has that opportunity and the ability to give something, to share in some way. Jesus is not with us today physically. Jesus is with us spiritually. But I pray that each of us can be that voice and that hand and the feet that reach out to care to others. Amen.